Good morning, everybody. It's December 4th, 2017, Monday. So, I want to go back in time a little bit to 1998, and I had just joined the military. My childhood friend, Rich, had joined as well. And through whatever reason, through fate, I don't know, we ended up in basic training together on the same floor. I was in one room, they called them a bay, and across from me, he was in the next bay. Different platoon, but just right there. Didn't plan it. We both joined from, I was in Montana at the time, he was in California. Just weird how it worked out that way. And while we were in basic, we had a lot of time, downtime, right, in between everything to kind of shoot the shit. And he really wanted me to write a Star Wars script so we could maybe do like a fan film. There had only been two fan films that I had known of at the time. One was Troops, which was this kind of like the show Cops. You remember Cops, right? I think it's still on TV, but with the stormtroopers. And then there was this other one called, I think it was called The Bounty's Tale. And it was like a Boba Fett story wrapped around a comic book. So it's kind of like the original Creepshow movie, where you have these comic book pages someone's flipping through, and you'd see a drawn panel, and you'd go into the panel, and they'd play out the scene in live action. And then when they get to something where, they didn't have the budget for, like spaceships, they'd pull back out of the comic book, and those would be drawn, and then they go back in to the live action. A technique, by the way, that I think should be used in television today. Seriously, it's just a genius narrative way around the budget. It was pretty cool. This is 1998-ish, 90. So I started thinking about that when I was in basic. When I came home that Christmas, I wrote down an idea that I had been able to think about in my head over and over. I learned in basic to never write down your ideas because if the drill sergeants get a hold of them, it can make your life difficult. So when I got back for Christmas break, I wrote down this idea, and it was like this. There was this video game that had come out a year or so before on the PlayStation 1 called Star Wars The Masters of Tarakasi. I called it Tarakai because I thought it'd sound better, but whatever. And basically, it was a fighting game, three-dimensional fighting game. And they added this character, Arden Lin, who would have been kind of like a Mara Jade type character, if you're familiar with Star Wars Legacy. But she used martial arts and the Force. And I thought, like, that would be the game. The game sucked. But the idea of using Kung Fu and the Force, I thought was a great alternative to the basis of the samurai and the Force being the samurai or the Arthurian knights, like a blend between the two, being the basis for the original Star Wars. and knowing that Lucas was developing the prequels and those were going to be out in another year, I didn't want to overlap. So I thought, okay, I'll start with this idea of the Kung Fu and the gunslinger, because there was a Western element to Star Wars that we all know now. But in 1998, I had to, do my own observations. And then the other thing was, one second. The other thing was, My buddy Rich wanted the main character to be called Starkiller because the original script was The Adventures of Starkiller. He had a character named Ben Starkiller, so I was like, okay, whatever. But I had this idea of uh, of a guy that used to be part of this planet where they did this kung fu force stuff, and then he left to kind of like pursue his personal dreams of independence or whatever, and then was forced to come back home, and everything was off. Like it was the basic idea. I'm 18, but that was a story I could relate to because I was coming back home. Not even just from the military. Before the military, I'd come back home from being away for a while, and just everything was, you're watching your childhood change drastically every 6 months. All the people you knew and you grew up with are just becoming different people. They're with families and jobs and lives, and some of them were just turning into different people. And you're parting ways, and there was this level of separation. Now, I'll be honest, this doesn't make for a blockbuster film with the word Star Wars on it, but I wasn't concerned with that. I was concerned with just telling this sort of dramatic story. And then I needed a visual hook. So I started buying a bunch of these magazines on kung fu and whatever, and they had all these different katas, right? These different levels of doing form with your arms and your hands and circling energy. And I thought, what if you could use the force instead of lifting rocks like they do in Empire Strikes Back, right? Like they lift the jet, they lift the rocks. Like, what if you could manipulate the environment? You could lift up the ground, move the water around with the force because it surrounds everything, it binds it. This is the idea I had that we would be able to do this. Now, I knew there was no way we could do this in live action. The minute I came up with this idea, it was a cool visual I knew we could never do. But I thought, well, maybe if we did it in comic book panels where I drew that stuff, or what if we just did a storyboard movie, right? We'll just do it all in storyboards. Or like a comic book, we just take each frame and then we'll do audio and whatever. So I set about to write this thing. I called it Star Wars: The Simple Truth. Now, not a very good name, but the idea was that you had these two factions on their planet, and in Star Wars canon at the time, the planet was called Bundakai. So you had Bundakai, and you had these two factions. One that believed in using the force for war, and the other one for using it for art, basically, right? And then you had this third faction, which was also in Star Wars canon, called the Epicanthics Legion. Just a small blurb about the Epicanthics Legion in Bundakai, and I couldn't remember for the life of me. But I thought, what if the Epicanthics Legion were like colonials, and they brought technology to this planet? Like they could be the Republic. They could be just like when Westerners went to Japan and brought guns, which sadly enough I learned from watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, the movie. So they had brought weapons, and this was sort of like the war guys were actually, which I used the term bogan because that came from the original Star Wars script, the bogans, and I forget the art guys. The bogans rejected this technology. They thought it was a perversion. But the other guys, the more democratic ones, were actually embracing this becoming part of the Republic. Like if we don't become part of this, then they could easily come in and just take us over. So if we join now, and I wanted to invert, like the guys that typically look like the bad guys had a point of view, and maybe they were right. And the guys that look like the good guys had a point of view, and maybe they were wrong. each were going about it in a way that, or maybe they were even right. Like they were both correct, and I wanted to show that even though we can both, I can have an opinion, you can have an opinion, and there's both an element of truth to that opinion. We're both right in a way, and we're both wrong. That we can go about resolving that in demonstrous ways, and that was the idea for that. So I came up with this idea, and then I spent the next 3 or 4 months writing the script. And by the time the episode 1 come out, I had this done. I wanted to beat episode 1, so I had this initial draft, and it kind of threw my friend off. I remember he was just like, this wasn't what he was expecting. He wanted Star Destroyers, and I had this character who just kind of like was a really bad bounty hunter. Like he was just bad. He was like a bodyguard. Like he was using his ability to manipulate the Force and Kung Fu for making money, right? And he lived on Narshada. I thought that'd be a nice shithole to live in. And he hung out at this bar, and he had like a surrogate father named Torque, which was a nod to Full Throttle, the video game. And when everything seems to hit its peak low, he gets a call to come back home. And seeing as how it's a good time to get out of Dodge anyway, he goes. So he goes, and this is a 90-page script I wrote, so I had 90 minutes to kind of get all this through. And he goes, and he gets a little bit of refresher course with his, he had a mentor named Kane Tunin. And I imagine Kane, I had to use the word Kane because it's Kung Fu, right? Kane was like a half cat, lion kind of humanoid creature. And I imagine him being voiced by Cisco, Avery Brooks, who played Captain Cisco in Deep Space Nine, because Deep Space Nine was my favorite Star Trek at the time and still is. And so I had him in the garden. They had these gardens, and these they could sculpt these gardens. They would sculpt them, but then they would also fight them and destroy them and then rebuild them. So you would train and destroy these gardens, manipulating them. If there would be a pond, there'd be some water. If there'd be a little bit of like a fire pit, there was some fire. If there was a little bit of like a rocky area with trees, it could manipulate the branches. And they would wreck these things. But at the end of training, they would also restore it. And so I had this whole scene like this. And then I had this other thing where the Bogans were, there was this main guy named Devilish Jorn, and he looked kind of like a giant mantis, like a mantis with shark's teeth. And devilish because, it's like the word devil. I mean, he wasn't really bad. And the Bogans were these little like creatures, these little wiry dudes with bug eyes. And I imagine they moved like little ants. Like, so there's one type of figure, and then this mantis dude named Devilish Jorn. And he had his superiors he was talking to, similar to like Vader with the holograms. So he'd go into this room, and there'd be these, instead of holograms, they had water. And the faces would appear in the water because they would be able to transmit signals through the water. And he would communicate with them also with kata. So he could do these different moves, these kata moves, and we would put subtitles. And then they would talk, and then he would do this form. And it was like this sort of respectful, traditional way of talking through form. And they basically give him the okay to destroy and attack. And so there's this big battle that takes place at the end. And it ends with Ben Starkiller wanting to use his blaster to kill Jorn. And he's warned not to do that, but he uses that and kills Jorn. And even though they win, it sets Ben up for like a fall later on. And it's sort of like supposed to be this first skirmish and something bigger. Now I wrote this, and then I started to kind of like draw. I had this opening sequence where he's in a ship, and his ship had these two prongs coming out in a cockpit, And if you want to see what I drew, it was actually the ship that was used in Attack of the Clones later. There's this ship that this bounty hunter has, and she has these long prongs in the front. Where if you just take the Millennium Falcon and drag it out way in the front, and you put a little cockpit back there, that's the same idea. Like we arrived at the same idea. So he's in this ship, and there's these three other bounty hunters called the Mopar brothers, and they're like the walrus guys, and they're chasing him. And he's got his duty's bodyguard, and I just called Kevin Spacey at the time. It's before I knew about Kevin Spacey and his crazy shit. But so we had this guy. He's trying to protect. Ben's trying to protect, and he's being chased by these three other ships. And he goes up into a meteor shower in this planet. So these meteors are coming into the planet, and he goes up into it. And they're flying through this, and I tried to draw this, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't draw one ship. I couldn't draw one. I couldn't do it. I was just like basically drawing triangles and arrows to kind of get things to go apart. And that's when I really realized like my imagination exceeded my technical ability to draw. And in the summer of 1998, or 99, I had to stop everything and sit down and learn how to like actually draw all the fundamentals so that I could make this project happen. Now something pretty amazing occurred that summer too, right? About a month later, a movie, The Matrix, came out. And I saw The Matrix and I was like, damn, that's a lot like what I was trying to do. That's a lot. I had a main character, Ben, who was a sort of white guy, looked like Keanu Reeves. I had his childhood friend. Her name was Crispin Lynn. I thought might be a sister to Arden or ancestor to Arden. And she looked just like Carrie Moss. And Kane Toonan looked a lot like Lawrence Fishburne. So I always thought that was weird, how I could come up with that and there was this thing being made that simultaneously did that. And then years later, 2003, 2004, 2000, I don't know, years later, there was a cartoon that came out called the Avatar, The Last Airbender, which was about exactly this, manipulating the elements in Kung Fu. And seeing that cartoon and knowing that I had sort of given up on this idea and moved on with my life to other projects was just a reminder that if you don't make your ideas come true, someone eventually will too, right? I mean, I had no way of animating this, but I knew if I spent a year drawing nothing but storyboards, I could have scanned them in the computer, figured out Adobe Premiere or something to make it time up, And I easily could have done that. Who would have watched it? I don't know. But I got caught up on the fact that I couldn't draw anything. I couldn't draw. I should have just drawn it with stick figures. I made the mistake of trying to draw basically all my ideas as they looked. I look back at it now. I could have spent 6 months doing basic perspective and construction every day. Obviously, I'm still in the Army, so every night and on the weekends when I had free time. And then come back. And then with just basic stick figures and shapes, get a first pass on one scene. Just get one scene working. Scan it in, time it up, get it working. Drop in some temp music, do my own little audio, see if I can make that work. Just with stick figures. And then go do the next scene. And then over the years, I could have improved each scene as I went along if I cared to do that, Or, like, that's what I would have done if I could tell myself now what I know now. So where am I going with all this? I don't know. I think the thing to remember, like the thing that I would like to remember is that I have some pretty complicated ideas right now. And finding the simplest way to get those ideas out there and then to iterate on them, I think is the smarter way. Versus trying to make sure all your ducks are in the row. Making sure you're good at everything before you start. Which is weird because that's not to say screw learning basic shit. screw learning, construction and shape design and all that stuff. You're going to need to do that, and you're going to need to get better at it to improve your art. But I do think if you have a strong idea, get a version of it down on paper. Get a version of it down. And if you hit a block, like I don't know how to draw cars, then take 90 days to sit down, learn construction, learn cars, trace over cars, break all the shapes down, figure out a way so you understand how they work. And then after 90 days, come back and test what you know. Test what you know. See if it's enough. If it isn't, then spend another 90 days and then come back and test it. Like if I had done that, I could have had this whole project up and on the internet by 2001 easily. Instead of talking about it 20 years later on a podcast at 8:16 a.m. in the morning. December 12th. December 4th, 2017. Good morning, everybody. Let's get to work.